Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the National Training Agency's first installment of its Technical and Vocational Education and Training webinar series. I am Ms. Kim Cowie, Marketing Officer acting from the NTA's Business Development and Communications Department, and I will be your moderator this morning. You're reminded to please keep your mics and video on mute during the presentation. This webinar series is aimed at sharing new and innovative information, experiences, insights, and best practices within the TVET landscape. Ultimately, these sessions are geared towards capacity building and the creation of a space where TVET stakeholders can connect, discuss, and collaborate. With that being said, today I have the pleasure of introducing this morning's presenter, the Manager, Research Planning and Development at the NTA, Dr. Patrice Paris-Searles. Under her current remit is the responsibility for labor market research, skills gap analysis, and training needs assessment. Dr. Searles possesses a wealth of experience within TVET, having worked in this space for more than 19 years. Her presentation today is entitled Anticipating Changes in Skills Needs, the Colombian Experience. So without further delay, let me hand you over to Dr. Searles.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Kim, for that gracious introduction. I want to extend my full appreciation to all the participants who took time out to register and have joined us this morning for this conversation on a topic that I am very passionate about. I don't, however, want this to be an interesting webinar that you once heard. It is my hope that through my short presentation and then the question and answer segment, that together we can begin to unpack this thing called skills anticipation and move the conversation forward. So as part of my role this morning, I think we should start one time. So give me a second to just share my screen. Let's see here. Okay, so here we go. So what are the specific objectives of the webinar? This morning, I am hoping that, first of all, I would discuss and indicate to you some of the major underlying premises of a particularly new model for skills anticipation, the Sinai model that comes out of Brazil and would have been developed by the ILO. I also think that by the time we finish our conversation together this morning, that we would be able to, we'll be able to really come to some understanding or decisions in terms of whether this model in particular is of any utility in our context. We'll look at the challenges and some of the benefits. And like I indicated in my opening remarks, I'm hoping that you continue the conversations within your individual institutions and environment and take the conversation forward. Why is this not moving? Sorry, it's not moving. My apologies, we seem to be having a little bit of technical difficulty moving between the slides. Right, there we go. Right. Okay, so we at the NTA have tried to contribute to this concept of matching labor market demands to labor market supply. We hold that it is critical that training and workforce development be tied to what is required in the industry. We feel that it is the best way to ensure that there is some kind of increased employability and productivity in our workforce. So we have attempted to address that by utilizing different models. If we have to be absolutely honest, though we think that we have been making some strides, it has not been without its challenges and shortcomings. And we therefore continue to explore ways in which we can improve and innovate as it relates to this particular mandate. So when the National Training Agency was invited to participate in an international seminar being held in Colombia, we of course got on board and were very enthusiastic to join the conversation. This international seminar, which took place last year, is actually a continuation of the South-South collaboration that would have been started by ILO Center for and SENAI. And for those of you not familiar, SENAI represents the National Service for Industrial Apprenticeship in Brazil. Sometime between the period 2012 and 2014, the ILO in its collaboration with SENAI would have gone to 22 countries where they would have exposed technical experts and professionals related to workforce development or the labor market remit. They would have exposed them to the principles of their prospective model of skills anticipation. So fast forward to 2017, they wanted to once again touch base with their stakeholders and explore their experiences and the different ways that they would have applied the model. The expectation was that over the 2 days, there would be some conversations specifically about how the model had been applied, how it had evolved, and what were the best practices that we could take from it. It was sponsored by the Ministry of Labor in Colombia, the National Apprenticeship Services of Colombia, and of course, ILO Center for, which has the major concern in terms of moving things forward within the region. The NTA, for its part, was extremely excited about being present and participating in this seminar, because the seminar, as I indicated, would have allowed a number of institutions and countries from the Portuguese-speaking and Spanish-speaking continents to come and critique what they had done. It was like a post-mortem, a pulse check to figure out whether there was really any utility to the model. The seminar therefore allowed for us to map the global experience and to pull out what would have been relevant in our individual context. By the honest conversation about what had worked and what didn't work, it was very beneficial to take some critical insights and advancements to the model forward. So what exactly is the prospective model? This prospective model would have been developed at a time when SENAI would have been trying to ensure that their programs were in fact satisfying the requirements of their labor market. They, however, recognized that there is a time lag, and this is something that we can all appreciate. There's often a time lag between when we go out into the field and collect the information, identifying what our skills needs are, and the time it takes for us to write the report, generate and disseminate, for it to get into the hands of training providers and institutions, for them now to meet, collaborate and discuss how they need to evolve their programming and their instructional techniques to satisfy the skill demand, then purchase equipment, train teachers, and put themselves in a position to take advantage of the changing demands, enroll students, teach them, train them, and then turn out persons into the workforce. So based on their experience, they seem to always be behind the loop. So they decided to come up with a framework and a model, and through trial and error, they came to a new perspective where they had found a way to answer two important labor market questions. They wanted to now focus on what are the new skills that will be needed in the near future. So the model took the conversation away from a discussion in terms of what was needed right now. They no longer try to ascertain what the skills gaps were currently, but try to get ahead of the race. So they looked at the near future. once they had identified the skills that would have been required in the near future, they wanted to also answer the question, what would be the reality of that to the profile of that occupational area? There was no way that this was really going to be a one-off arrangement, and it wasn't an instantaneous model that emerged. It took a long time. It took a long time for the model to be developed and implemented. And it eventually caught the interest of other institutions. They began to also replicate it themselves. And this is where ILO Center 4 had flagged it as a best practice and decided to take it on board and disseminate it further.
Tell me, Crystal, tell me.
So what does the model do? The model is predicated on skills foresighting techniques rather than a forecasting perspective. So unlike the customary call for quantification of skills gap, the model addresses the quality of those skills gaps.
Yes.
And therefore, it employed a number of foresighting techniques to look at the changes that would have been happening in the labor market, whether it was coming out of the economic condition, technological changes, or whether the organization itself was evolving. It meant that there was less reliance on hard, rigorous statistical data that is often required for forecasting. It utilized a more qualitative sort of arrangement to get the information that was necessary. The model, therefore, attempted to look at 3 levels of analysis. It looked at technology, what was happening in the organization, and what was happening with occupations specifically. It therefore allowed for a very systematic way of collecting information that would have reflected skills anticipation. Because of its very qualitative nature, one unique feature of the model was that is that it requires the ongoing interaction between stakeholders. Stakeholders were encouraged to come together to have the conversation to lead to the generation of the information that you needed. And because the model specifically looked at 3 distinct areas, it meant that you had a cross-functional kind of arrangement. You would have had persons who would definitely align themselves in terms of decision-making and policy-making. You would have had university think tanks and researchers, as well as sectoral stakeholders and employers themselves joining the conversation. These engagements sometimes happen simultaneously. Sometimes they had to wait for the work of one group to be completed before the other group can start the exercise and move it forward. So what are the critical steps involved in the model? This is a nice prospective model for skills anticipation. First off, starts off with a technological assessment. Here's where stakeholders who are in the know are invited to join the conversation and identify new and emerging technologies that experts would have felt are going to have some kind of significant impact within the sector and the industry. It meant not only identifying recently launched tools, products, and technologies, but it also required the identification of perhaps things that would have been launched in the past that were not adapted and adopted as quickly as the producers had intended and are viewed as a dud. But yet stakeholders around the table were saying, no, keep your eye on this particular software, keep your eye on this particular piece of equipment. It's going to have utility in the future. So that meant that the group, the persons who you actually invited to join the conversation to come up and brainstorm on the emerging technologies would have had to be persons who knew and were experienced in different areas. Sometimes it is easy to become very focused on what is familiar to you. So that if it is that you're into animation, you're looking at the world from that lens. If it is that you're into robotics, you're looking at your industry from that lens. It, however, meant that there was supposed to be, or it should be encouraged, that there would be some kind of cross-functional, so that even though that you're in renewable energy, you still might pull a technology perspective and a possibility from construction, or you might pull it from another area. But by and large, it was to look at the technologies, the tools, the equipment that would have an impact on your sector. And the timeline, again, because it is very futuristic, would have been those things that would be applicable and relevant within a 5 to 10 year period. That period had been decided because that was where they felt it was easiest to allow all the other stakeholders to get on board, so that the training providers can make adjustments to their curricula. They could buy the tools and equipment for simulation. They can get ahead and be prepared to service the industry in a very practical and feasible way. The second step of the model required a look at the organization. So now, having identified and through a series of roundtable conversation and filtering it down, you would have had a short list of technologies that stakeholders felt would have been of most relevance. Having identified those pieces of technology, the model asks the question, how then is that going to impact on the organization structure? How will organizations organize and arrange themselves to produce this new product or service? Again, within the same 5 to 10 year period. This reflects that while the conversation may have been started with a specific group of specialists and experts, the latter step would have required for you to now go into the field and perhaps interface with HR professionals or employers themselves, so that the grouping that you utilize throughout the model evolves and changes as the need arises. The third step. Okay, so we have now gotten a list of possible technologies that they deem would be important in the sector and industry within the next 5 to 10 years. We have worked out how the organization is going to evolve to include such technology. There's now a borrowing down in the model to have the conversation in terms of what is the specific impact of those expectations on what the occupation would look like, the occupational profile. It means then that the conversation needs to continue. And now you're having the discussion about, are you going to have new occupation, new and emerging occupations, things that never existed before? There was no job title, there was no JD for it. It is completely new competencies, new sets of knowledge. Or is it a scenario where there would have been existing occupations that now need to incorporate a new technology, a new piece of knowledge base? So through the conversation, you would have the identification of new and emerging occupations or evolving occupations. You move all of that now forward to say, okay, we now know what the industry requires in terms of the competency of the workforce to interface with that kind of technology. They're now going to have to map whether there is any existing program that services that, and do some kind of training or educational gap analysis. It looks at what the industry has pegged as being the knowledge, skills, competencies required by the specific occupational area against what exists in the field. And this is the information that is going to be of most importance to the training provider, because that is the information by which they have some credence to go and make adjustments, make huge sums of investment in terms of remodeling themselves to satisfy this new need. There's an optional step here. During the seminar, what was quite evident was that the countries that had a supporting statistical framework that provided robust data were able to take the conversation even further and allow the analysts to do the trend analysis. so that they would be able to quantify the amounts of the specific jobs, whether they were new jobs or emerging jobs that the industry would have been demanding. However, for those countries that did not have that kind of statistical data to stand on, this was a step that was often overlooked. But I still felt it was important for us to know what the ideal is. The ideal is that one day we will be able to have the quality of statistical data that should allow us to say in very confident and a very confident manner that these are the numbers of the different occupations that the country would require. Once you have generated all the information that is coming out of the new and emerging technology, the information that is coming out in terms of the organizational design, the information that is emanating from our conversations about the occupational profile, there comes a point in time when you now have to filter everything and identify some clear and specific recommendations for future action. And that is what the model terms a thematic antenna. Of course, the expectation is that everything that is happening is going to be monitored on an ongoing basis. Because the reality is that while you start the conversation to start plotting the way forward for a particular industry, I am just being prompted to remind everyone to please mute their microphones because there seems to be some feedback on the system. Thank you very much. Yes. The assumption is therefore that you may start the conversation in plotting the way forward for a specific industry, but while you are doing that, there are other things that are happening within the environment that may change. So there's a constant need to monitor everything that is happening under the foresighting model and experience to ensure that you're adjusting as you go. So after all the papers and conversations, they were able to identify 3 areas in which the model was being utilized. I threw in the 4th because it was something that occurred to me while I was there. So we knew that the model would obviously allow us to track occupations that were in fact in decline and those that were expected to grow. It would signal to training providers how they needed to adjust their training programs. But what was interesting is that there was a host of persons who were discussing the possibility, I should say, that having embarked upon the discussion, the stakeholder engagements about technology, that what we were actually creating was an artificial technological innovation and adoption and not a natural progression of things. Meaning, some persons challenged that they wondered if the technologies that had been flagged by the experts would have really been adopted in the time frame that they had indicated naturally, or whether the adoption was actually boosted because there was this ongoing fervent discussion about it. So because everybody was saying smartphones are important, smartphones are important, smartphones are important, by the time the smartphone was launched, everybody grabbed it up because they already were operating with the assumption that the smartphone was going to prove itself important. So I stuck in that the model somehow finds a way to also boost the dissemination of technology and knowledge within the industries. So what does that mean for us? Overall, during all the presentations, it was a relief for me, especially since my remit is in labor market assessment and skills anticipation, that our experience in Trinidad and Tobago is not overly unique. The reality is that it is a very complex exercise, and it is something that is often daunting. The reality is that no jurisdiction, no country has been able to perfectly match labor market supply to labor market demand. It, however, did not mean that they moved away from the need and the emphasis in providing and developing mechanisms to allow for stakeholders within the labor market to adjust and evolve and to satisfy the needs and conditions for success. Because the reality was that there were serious implications for not attempting to match the skills. On an individual level, there's an impact in terms of low wages and low job satisfaction. At the country level, we're talking about low productivity within the workforce and low returns on our investments into education and training. So the option to not attempt it was too high. It was not even self-entertained, I apologize. So that they knew that regardless of the complexity of it, it was still important to make some effort to do the skills anticipation and mapping. In terms of the lesson learned, what was interesting was that even in the developed nations, there was still need for that sensitization of policymakers and administrators to understand and appreciate exactly what is possible within the local context. There was often, therefore, a need to make sure that everybody was on the same page in terms of expectation. What could be practically achieved within the time frame and within the context. There was a drive to ensure that persons understand that there is a distinction between skills foresighting, which is a futuristic, visionary kind of approach, as opposed to forecasting, which economists and politicians tend to love because they get hard numbers that they can wrap their minds around. Because of the qualitative nature of it, relationship and trust was found to be a very, very, very important ingredient to the mix. The messenger was just as important as the message. Some institutions, because they were government, had a difficulty in convening meetings and getting stakeholders on board because they felt that the government was coming with an agenda. It took time and effort to woo persons. And oftentimes you saw the better results emanating from the arrangement where the persons or the institutions who were actually leading the exercise already had some level of credibility within the environment. So persons were more likely to collaborate and partner. Group dynamics, of course, will always be important when you have strong personalities and experts coming together around the table. It wasn't a matter of running off because the loudest voice was saying it, but it really required the ongoing interaction and negotiating to get to the point where persons were satisfied with what would have been emanating out of the exercise. Interestingly, the reality is that a prospective outlook is not an instantaneous competence. It has to be learned. Oftentimes when they approached the industry persons, it was difficult for them to wrap their mind around that future impact. Trying to figure out today what the environment is going to look like in 5-10 years. What many countries and many institutions also did was that they tailored the findings. Because you can appreciate that a lot of information is going to come after the engagement. So instead of just shelving it, they package it specifically for different stakeholders. So they knew what was important to the training providers, so they packaged a report for them. They articulated it in a way that it would be easily digested by those stakeholders. Someone else who wants a more robust conversation in terms of evolving and new technology, they did reports that would have been better suited for those persons. The reality, though, is that the model has not reached a point of stasis. It continues to be evolve and continue to be applied in different ways. So what, therefore, is the way forward for Trinidad and Tobago? Well, from where we sit, having participated in the seminar for 2 days, the NTA feels very strongly that the model has merit. If for no other reason than it takes the conversation away from what are the gaps now to what will be the future needs for the country and the industries. Because oftentimes when we do our evaluation, it's difficult to really add value. Simply because by the time we exit the field and write the report, there's no guarantee that the vacancies and the needs that would have been flagged still exist. So I feel that personally that this is something that I would want the NTA to take an active gamble at piloting the model in Trinidad and Tobago, if not in its entirety, aspects of it. The model can also help recognizing in our local context that sometimes it's difficult for our industry persons to have that futuristic conversation because they are not always aware of all the technological changes that will impact their sector. So being mindful of this, I am still holding that the model can allow us to strengthen scenario building. It gives us the opportunity as industry and sector representatives to shape what our future looks like. We can come up with a vision to say, this is what the manufacturing sector should look like. This is what the technology should incorporate. This is how the organizations should be arranged. And then through back engineering and the same in stakeholder engagement, have the conversation in terms of, okay, if we want that outcome, what do we need to do to adjust the capacity and the competencies of the workforce now? So there's the utilization of the model for strengthening the roadmap and scenario building is something that we can all explore. And borrowing from the experience of the international partners, there's no harm from where I sit in having a conversation about what are the technological impact that is going to happen within the environment within the 5 to 10 year time frame. There's no harm that could be articulated. If we start the conversation and then it alerts persons, alerts the practitioner to perhaps take a closer look at these technologies, then the NTA would have done its part in terms of allowing the community to evolve and innovate and stay abreast of best practices. A lot of the NTA's focus, therefore, going forward, in its support of knowledge transference, in its support of capacity building for the sector, has to be underpinned by collaboration, and a collaboration across the board. And this is why the model is of particular attractiveness to me. It allows the stakeholders to join the conversation and have a voice. It allows us to begin to align so that I now have a greater appreciation of what the employer's perspective is. I have an appreciation of the frustrations that the teacher might feel in terms of delivery and tools and equipment and keeping abreast of their craft. And if we are all around the table, respecting and conversing with each other, connecting for the strengthening of TVET, then we expect to see accelerated innovation, we expect to see increased returns on investment, and we expect to see a greater responsiveness to the needs of the sector. So in closing, my final words. I want to alert you to the fact that much of the reports and the presentations that would have been delivered over those 2 days, clearly wariness is beginning to step in, over the 2 days of the international seminar are available online. There's also a database of prospective studies. So there's no need for any institution to recreate the wheel. If it is that there is difficulty in trying to generate the ideas in terms of what are the specific technologies that are expected to impact different sectors. I am almost confident that some industry in some jurisdiction would have already worked out the list. So it may be a good starting point for anyone who wants to explore this model further. I would also like to flag that the ILO Center for, they have done a lot of work in pulling together this dialogue on anticipating skills needs. So there's a compendium that you can access online as well. Just do a Google search and it will pop up. There are 6 volumes on it, and it covers everything from street studies to scenario and skills for site development. That I feel that we should take some time and explore. And on that note, I want to thank you for your attention and your patience for all the technical glitches. It's our first attempt at the webinar, so be patient with us. And I want to thank you for a dynamic conversation. No pressure.
Thank you, Dr. Sills, for such an insightful and interesting presentation. And thank you for bearing with us. As Dr. Sills said, this is our first installment of the webinar series. I trust everyone enjoyed and appreciated it. Thanks once again. At this point, we would like to open the discussion to you, the participants, for any comments or questions that you may desire to voice at this time. Remember, though, that time is limited, but we will try our best to entertain as many questions or comments as possible. So don't be shy, anyone. Let's see our first question. Anybody?
Okay, sir. Who's talking? Anybody?
Okay, question.
We have a comment from Deborah Ferdinand James saying, yes, indeed, a very informative and instructive seminar.
Thank you, Deborah.
And also, very good attempt. So, Dr. Sills, we had a question for you. What is the greatest obstacle to applying this model in our local context?
From Caracas.
Let me see if this. Go back to. Right. Good. Good question. I think the reality is in this particular model, the greatest obstacle may just simply be building the momentum. I feel that oftentimes there's an expectation that there's going to be an instantaneous generation of needed data. And to get persons to appreciate that it's a process and that you have to have time and effort to pull persons together for them to get accustomed to trusting each other and how the dynamics of the group runs, and then working towards the end of identifying what actually skills needs are. From our experience in the National Training Agency, I think another challenge to our utilization of this model is simply because I do not know if we are at the point where it's easy for stakeholders to start thinking in visionary, nebulous kind of terms. We know what exists now, so I can tell you what my needs are right now. But sometimes I think it is difficult for them to skip forward and try to figure out what exactly will be needed in the future, and therefore identify it with confidence. They may be willing to say, well, I am aware of this technology or this software, or this piece of equipment, but to hazard and stand up and say, okay, I think that it's going to have an impact, and therefore allow for the evolution, I think is going to be difficult. Not impossible, just difficult. And that is why, even in preparing for the webinar, I felt it was important to flag the ILO's database on prospective studies. Because I feel that sometimes we might have to rely on a guided democracy. Instead of leaving it blank to come to the stakeholder and ask for their contribution and their ideas in terms of where the industry is evolving, it may be feasible in the first couple of instances to actually do the groundwork for them. Go to other prospective studies for the specific industry, flag what are the technologies that would have been flagged, that would have been highlighted internationally as being important within that sector, and then have that first conversation with them, looking at that pool of new innovations and new technology, and figure out, okay, out of these, which one is of the greatest import to the local scenario. So I think that is where the challenge is going to be, getting persons on board with what is expected for a prospective study.
And thank you, Dr. Sills. We have another question. How can we norm this model for our context?
How can we norm? For our context, there can be no progress without effort. And sorry to wax philosophical on you, but I think the only way that norming is going to happen is if it is that we start doing something. The model is made up of a number of parts that collectively brings us closer to a highly probable footing. That does not eliminate the possibility of saying, okay, I'm a training institution and I'm only going to do this element or this aspect of it, because I know what my resources are. I know what my funding and what my facility looks like. So I won't be able to service everything, but I can evolve to service this particular need. And therefore, we begin to have that qualitative engagement with each other, have the conversations, and work towards generating information using the model, even if it's not in its entirety. So the norming happens where each of you go back to your offices, sit and begin to unpack everything that you heard today, play over the webinar, go and do your research, and then have the conversation within your own institutional context in terms of what is the relevance of this? Can this be of any importance to us moving forward and strengthening our labor market-led training initiatives? Yes.
Thank you. We have another question here. Nehurst does foresighting led by consultants from New Zealand. Can this be piggybacked on?
Yay! Easy like that, we just got a partner. Yes, most definitely. The reality is that this is, while it may be new to some of us, it's not something that is unheard of in other jurisdictions and other programs. So if someone already, like for instance, Nehis, is already working with the consultants to do some foresight, I'm just saying, collaborate. Again, open up the conversation, include someone, even if it is not in the project, but let us see what your project document looks like. Let's see what your lesson learns, the mishaps, so that we ourselves don't repeat the same effort. Disseminate, disseminate, disseminate. Right? I see someone's hands up.
Someone else?
No, I'm not seeing it.
No. Yeah, it probably went. Right, so another question we have is, has the NTA applied any aspect of this model into its labor market research?
Yes, we have. In its original construction, our data collection tool would have gone out into the field to ask the questions along the lines of what are the occupations that employers expect will be contracting within the next 12 months, or whether there are any new occupational areas that are of relevant to the employer's operation. We would have also asked what were their skill needs. We have decided and we have implemented a slight variation on that. So when we go out into the field, we also have a qualitative component where we meet with industry captains, and having done some background work to flag different technological developments within the sector, we ask specific pointed questions in terms of, do you see this piece of technology, or do you see this new product, service, tool, machinery, whatever it is, being of relevance to you specifically, as in your company specifically, or the industry in Trinidad and Tobago, more collectively? And based on that response, we are then able to ask the questions in terms of, in what way? Is this a minor adjustment in terms of an occupational area that you just now, because drivers are now going to be interfacing with GPS tools within their vehicles, or having handheld devices when they go to deliver mail, that you're just going to add a new competency to an existing portfolio, or is it something new and innovative? And that information we have been able to capture. However, it is not in the manner proposed in the model. That's the truth of it. It is a sample of industry persons who are interested in meeting with us and having the conversation. It's not that cross-cutting discussion with a host of practitioners in the sector. So yes, we have applied it in a very small regard, and we are seeing the utility in the information that is coming out of it, but there is still room for us to expand that to perhaps do a series of focus group conversations to ascertain the information that we are looking for.
Right, moving on to the next question. Can this model be applied to the national security sector, more so in law enforcement?
Of course. The reality is that there are some sectors that, because of international expectations and protocols that they would have had to sign on to, they already know. It's not optional what pieces of technology they will have to interface with. They would already know, because it is a mandate. It's not if you feel that they would have to subscribe in order to continue the relationship with foreign and international partners. In that regard, you still have the conversation. It's easier because you already know the pieces of technology, the adjustments in terms of protocols and expectations for the functioning of officers or the functioning of investigators, that you can now do the back engineering to say, okay, in order for us to be able to prove to our international partners that we have these qualified persons in these areas, what would we need to do? And it's the same conversation. You look at your training institutions that currently serve the national security sector, figure out whether there are any persons or bodies there that are doing it, whether it's in part or in its entirety. Start to figure out, okay, what would be needed in terms of learning resource, instructional material, assessment tools, equipment, whatever, to train up officers, or I'm saying officers because they often refer to officers, to get to the point where they can now service and satisfy the demand within their specific sector. So yes.
Thank you. We have just about maybe 10 minutes left, and I see a couple more questions here.
there's an outcry immediately about whether we have the resources to do that. We don't have the econometrics, statistical experience in doing national forecasting. But there are institutions that do. So to answer your question, where would we get the numbers for the skills gap? I think we need to manage our expectations. It will come perhaps from a fusion of the Ministry of Labor, CSO, University of the West Indies. But in the meantime, while we are trying to get the robust statistics that would allow us to do that time series and trend analysis, we still have to answer the call of our stakeholders. So because the NTA is focused on workforce development, training provider quality assurance, I felt it was still important for us to expose the community to another model that can be used in the interim. Not replacing, not better than, not less than, just different from the quantifying of the skills. Yes?
Okay, we have time maybe for just one or two more questions. So
Is it that Caesar, are you?
Yeah, me. Hi, everyone.
Question, can employment agencies assist in skills anticipation?
Yes,
is anyone
most
here?
Definitely.
Hello?
I have a vision of one day being able to walk into the Guardian newspapers or the Express and have their classified information to do that vacancy analysis, and I'll get that body of information to begin to interrogate and manipulate and say, oh, this is where the most vacancies are posted, and this is where you have less demands for a particular occupational area. That is a dream. That's a thought that I had some time ago, but in very practical terms, yes, employment agencies can also contribute, because I think that they also have their pulse on the industry. They know where the gaps are, where the greatest demand lie, and they are oftentimes frantically trying to screen persons and go through their database of clients to see who they can in fact send to the specific industry. So they represent perhaps an untapped resource that is available to the conversation about what industry actually needs.
Okay, one more question to Dr. Sills. What do you see as the greater priority, skills foresighting, qualifying the skills gap, or skills forecasting?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I think it depends on where you are within the environment. If it is that you are, like for instance, if it is that your remit for the National Training Agency is to coordinate TVET and ensure that there is industry-led training, then I would say that the priority right now would be for the skills foresighting, simply because it allows for that boring down to the organizational changes and the occupational changes that would be of most relevance to the majority of our stakeholders. So that is a product that you can see that will keep on giving. You will not only be able to flag the skills gaps that exist, but you will also be able to have the conversation with the wider stakeholder group in terms of what are the implications of that skills gap, and be able to help and guide and facilitate the evolution towards the alignment between labor market needs and labor market supply. So, but that is only because I'm wearing the hat of the National Training Agency. I strongly suspect that if it is that you speak to another stakeholder, someone from the Ministry of Labor, or from someone who is about that multi-sectoral analysis in terms of what is actually needed within our population, then they would, of course, say, no, the priority would be to quantify, because that is the only way that we can really truly plan on a national level. So I don't think it is fair or accurate to have it in terms of a either or priority, because it will vary depending on the stakeholder that you speak to. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sills.
Thank you, everyone. I think we are coming to the close of the webinar.
Yes, thanks everyone for your participation. And as we said, look out for the email with the recording of the video, and we look forward to your participation in our upcoming webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a blessed morning, everyone. Bye-bye.